And I'm here with Rita, who is the Science Communications Associate Manager at DECIEM.
Yes.
And you are also completing a master's in cosmetic science at UAL. Thank you so much for agreeing to
Yes.
do this pocket talk for our
Thank
sunscreen
you.
conference. And this pocket talk is going to be about the ordinaries or DECIEM in general's everything is a chemical or everything is chemicals campaign. And I'll just get started with my first question. Why did DECIEM decide to start the Everything is Chemicals campaign? And just in general, how did it get started?
So it actually was born from an idea that I had during my placement year at DECIEM. And my placement was on transparency in ingredient and product safety. And I looked at clean beauty and at the mistrust that consumers had in the industry. And I proposed a way of giving consumers trust without leaning into, the clean beauty fallacy. The first proposal was a huge undertaking, so I'm not going to go into the details. But the second proposal was educating consumers. Because it's something that DECIEM has always done. And it was a conversation that we were already having in our scientific department, which is quite big, but it was really growing at the time. It was becoming a huge department. We were really just disappointed at the way that the concept of toxic was being misconstrued and how it deserved a retelling of its story, right? And with DECIEM's previous track record, it was really just a clear step forward for us to continue that legacy. And the brand team was really receptive to that. And they really felt like our hyper educated consumers were the perfect audience for this.
And my experience working with brands, this kind of campaign, well, is very unique and it's made a big splash. It's challenging with the misinformation that is out there. Brands that I work with typically will just go with the flow because this is what consumers are after. This is especially if you're in some of the retailers like Kleenex or sorry, Sephora. Sephora is looking for some of these keywords. So
Yes,
yeah, this has definitely made a splash. So I'm interested in your perspective here. What
absolutely.
have you learned along the way of the Everything is Chemicals campaign?
Well, we've learned so much, but we definitely learned that, you know, you have open-minded consumers if only you excite them about the information that you give them. So we really had to excite them about the nuances of science and make them accessible to them, right? And it's quite interesting that you spoke about, the clean at Sephora, because at the time so this was like the proposal of the idea was just, it stayed in the project for a while. It didn't really go into, I don't know, production of the campaign for a while, but it really started all to kind of like go, get underway and kind of like developing from an idea to an actual concept because of headlines talking about the Clean at Sephora campaign. And not because Sephora themselves were saying this, but because journalists that were perhaps less informed was saying that Sephora was moving towards a chemical-free future. I don't know if you remember this. So
I do.
I know that for us, saying something like a chemical-free future sounds absolutely baffling, but people have access to information, but sometimes they may not have access to such a kind of like a wealth of information as we do as scientists or as hyper educated consumers that are very interested in science. We had been already inspired by the work of all the cosmetic scientists and scientists in general that work in the cosmetics realm and social media, such as yourself. But we really felt like a lot of our consumers, despite being hyper educated when it comes to skincare, they might not rub shoulders with people with a scientific background as much as we do within our department, and your listeners would as well, right? And your followers. So we really felt like we really had to make it as accessible as possible, to include the people that don't have that understanding of chemical as, like, I like to call it, the language of everything, because it really is like, we use chemistry to communicate the making of everything around us. So that is why we call it everything is chemicals. That's why we took such a simplistic approach, because that might not be obvious to everyone. From the beginning, we wanted to start by countering this fear of the word chemical. And once we understood that there's so much chemistry in nature, it becomes impossible, to be afraid of chemicals that are made synthetically. But we also learned that cherry picking is still prevalent. We really had to cover our bases. And by covering all our bases, there is, a lot of room for error, because we were really, really covering a very wide array of subjects and condensing them into these little pieces of information. And sometimes, details escaped us. It really was like a peer review effort, right? We have a super kind of like large team. We have, your toxicologists, your microbiologists, your R&D chemists. We have people with a background in biology. We have everything. So we really had to hone into everyone's different skills and make sure that if there was a specific subject that someone was an expert in, that we checked with them to make sure that it was okay. And even then, there would be some hiccups, or there would be some things that we couldn't say or that we shouldn't say. So it was a lot of teamwork.
And now I'm just thinking about some of the conversations that I've had with, especially the larger players in the cosmetics industry, that they had a hard time not caving to not necessarily misinformation, but they would include free from claims, and they didn't want to include free from claims, but there was consumer pressure. And now we have all these additional wanted free from lists that are being pushed by retailers, not only Clean at Sephora, now it's Walmart. There's all these docu-series that are coming out. Most recently, I'm sure you've seen the HBO, but the misinformation is everywhere. And I know from conversations I've had with large brands who have tried to not feed into the misinformation. When they didn't, then their sales dipped. And then eventually they were just forced to. Now, maybe they didn't think creatively as you guys have, and think about these potential options for educating consumers. I don't know. I'm not on their team. But for industry members, whether they're the large players or the smaller players who feel like, oh, it's brand suicide if I include parabens or whatever ingredient that is vilified. Do you have any advice for industry on fighting misinformation?
Absolutely. I mean, going, back to this, issue with it comes from like the very elemental, lack of understanding of basic chemistry, but also, of reading a peer-reviewed piece of work where, the information that is there is very nuanced, and then a specific statement is taken out, aka cherry picked and taken out of context, and then the information spreads. A lot of people don't even go back to that one study that spread the misinformation. So it's really important to, not assume, and to really be excited about educating consumers. And sometimes that might include, really having to do some extensive work. I do feel like, we really wanted to explain the nuances of toxicology, that dose makes a poison, how the same chemical can be perfectly safe in one scenario, but toxic in another. This is something that it needs to be instilled in consumers, especially the dose makes a poison, I think, because a lot of ingredients are vilified for having one effect in one circumstance that has nothing to do with its application in cosmetics. That was the case of sulfates for a while, for a long time still. And we really tried with our ProSulfate campaign to counteract that. And it was still very, very hard. You're still going to get people pushing back, but being ready with responses and being very responsive and reacting quickly is key. not only educating, but also if there's a new question, responding quickly and responding accurately and honestly. We also believe that, if someone decides to do this task to combat misinformation, work with experts. That's like my last advice, my biggest advice: work with experts, because I have seen a lot of brands trying to, take science and make it their brand. But because the team that produces their content isn't necessarily in communication with scientists all the time, or maybe they don't have kind of like a varied team, they're only working with one person, and it's in science, you can't just work on your own. You need to borrow expertise from other people a lot of the time, especially if you're describing, scientific theories, etc. That's the whole basis of peer-reviewed work, is you get other people to review it.
Agreed. I've seen a lot of brands kind of fall short on social media because, of course, they didn't consult scientists, and then they end up drawing basic chemical structures wrong. And so you brought up the ProSulfate campaign, and you kind of alluded to the answer here, but why did DECIEM decide to focus specifically on sulfates for your ProSulfate campaign?
Well, firstly, because we felt that it is an ingredient that is really misunderstood, and it would be very easy to make a case for it, especially after the Everything is Chemicals campaign and the great response that we had from our consumers. I think that gave us a huge boost of confidence, right? It comes from everything, like marketing techniques, misinformation, misunderstandings of safety, environmental impact, data. All of this contributed to the anti-sulfates rhetoric that we know. But the impact that it had in the industry was so surprising to a lot of formulators, because sulfates are so useful and affordable. They make for very affordable products, and more than anything, we know that the formulation makes the product, not the ingredient. But we wanted to really communicate this, and we wanted to make a point of using this ingredient that's been vilified, choosing a sulfate that by nature is already gentler than sodium lauryl sulfate, which is still a great ingredient in its own right. But we wanted to explore sodium lauryl sulfate. So we used SLES2, 2 degrees of ethoxylation, increased mildness, and we also used a lower percentage than a lot of products in the market, and focused on formulating for mildness, testing for non-irritation and non-sensitization. But obviously these are all tests that are standard, that we do in a lot of our other products. But by communicating these steps, by educating the consumer on all the steps that we took to make sure that the sulfates were as gentle as possible, it really gave them some peace of mind. But it was a decision that, I guess, my team, we were all super worried about it. We were like, oh my God, we're going to have to come up with all these answers. But everyone is surprisingly so receptive. So it was really, really exciting to see.
I'll finish this pocket talk with the question that I ask at the end of every podcast interview. I'm sorry I didn't give you a heads up. So do you have any final take-homes that you would like to lead our audience here, as well as for the replay of this conference? Any take-homes that you'd like to leave them with? Or maybe there are some points that we haven't had a chance to cover yet for this conversation that you think are important.
Absolutely. I mean, I know that a lot of the viewers that are going to be listening to us and watching us are people that work in the industry and that are, facing, this kind of war against and, pro the misinformation in the cosmetics industry. And, I just really want to emphasize the importance of, collaborating with scientists. I feel like that's not done enough. And I know I've said it before, but it's a very important part of the cosmetics industry, especially now that our consumers are more and more like looking more and more to get their own information. A lot of the times, when you do your own research, you can just get the answers that you're looking for. And if you're looking for answers that are, leading to fear, or leaning on fear, which is something that the human species is very comfortable around for some reason, you will end up getting those answers that are going to make you more scared. So, the misinformation a lot of the time starts within brands, or starts within the media, then it's even made even more powerful by brands. What we can do is really contract to inform consumers about the nuances of science, and especially of toxicology, how it is such a complex field, in the scientific field, that borrows from many other fields. And once we communicate that, I think that, as we were the propellers of, new developments in so many different fields. For example, the cosmetics industry is the biggest propeller in new developments in safety testing and the reduction of animal use in safety testing. Why can't we also be the propellers of the end of fear mongering, right? Why can't we be the ones that break this barrier and make consumers ask the right questions? Then that could spread to other industries that are suffering from this fear mongering, like the food industry, and so on. So I do think that we have what it takes. We've done it before, and I would love to see us do it again.
I think that's such a great place to end this pocket talk on. Thank you so much for your time.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.